Capital Record, where we defend free enterprise and capital markets because we believe in the dignity of the human person. Hello and welcome to David Bahnsen's Capital Record, brought to you by National Review, where I am going to be talking about today what you could argue is the essence of the Capital Record podcast, what is certainly in my mind the essence of the subject of economics, which is, I think, this tension that you could argue exists between a vision of the good life and the self-interest that we care about in economic advancement. The things we do that create wealth and prosperity, and the things that we care about as moral human beings with a spiritual calling and responsibility, and how these things all fit together, and the different schools of thought that exist around how these things interact. I'm inspired to this subject by a quote I'm going to read right now verbatim from my old friend Kevin Williamson, who had a recent article at the Dispatch, and this particular segment, I think, is profoundly important as a tee-up to me being able to critique the fatal flaw of, I think, left-wing economics, which is in a lot of ways a fatal flaw of new right economics. I quote Kevin verbatim here. "The real founding fathers of our country were, of course, the people we call the Pilgrims. They believed that the good life was to be found in contemplation and Christian community, and that these things were enabled and fortified by prosperity. Do you know what they did in 1627? They negotiated a trade deal with the Dutch colonists down the road in New Amsterdam. They knew where prosperity comes from because they had landed on the rocky shores of Massachusetts in the winter and had watched half of their party die, trying to scratch a living out of the ground while rapidly depleting the supplies they had brought with them. They didn't believe in autarky. They believed in thrift and trade, and they believed in being useful. It took their descendants a long time to make themselves rich enough to be this stupid." End quote. What he means by that end is this idea that if we really care about the good life, we are not focused on trade. We're not focused on prosperity, that this usefulness and productivity is a little bit overrated, that the need of the hour is a sort of redefined understanding of contemplation and Christian community. And what Kevin is doing here, and most certainly with me as an echo, and I want to add to it and kind of elaborate here in today's podcast, is not remotely disputing this vision of a good life that is rooted to Christian community, that is rooted to fellowship of mankind, that is rooted to a certain way of being for the human person, and the contemplative person is a part of the good life. The issue is putting those things in tension with prosperity, not prosperity fed by greed, corruption, by cronyism, but a prosperity fed by productivity. I love this adjective that Kevin uses, useful, by being useful. The usefulness and productive life is something that is in a positive feedback loop, a virtuous cycle with the good life. The prosperity that comes from this facilitates more contemplation, facilitates more community. In the extreme example of our early settlers, because we weren't dying. And throughout history, in more prosperous societies, there's the access to greater health, greater sustenance, and in the more obvious sense, greater advancement. So the table stakes of not being dead is a good element, but then beyond the mere surviving, but the thriving that comes when we are actually pioneering. And this pioneering that is driven by this particular vision of a good life. Well, why does this matter so much? I believe that it is very tempting, it is rhetorically seductive to suggest in an almost Marxian context and in certainly a Pharisaical one that I'm not interested in a prosperous life. I'm not interested in a prosperous society. I'm not interested in profits. We're not interested in all these artifacts of greedy capitalism because I'm fully focused on the contemplative life, a good life that is removed from material concerns. And I don't have a much more charitable way to say it than what Kevin said, which is only one rich enough to have the things they have that it can be stupid enough to say something like that. In other words, ignoring the fact that you're only able to say it from the perch of a prosperity that allows such an absurdity to come out of your own mouth. We do not believe that material well-being guarantees a good life. We do believe that there is a physical dimension to the human existence that is not the entirety of it, but neither is it to be ignored. You know, there's sort of an expression for those who are familiar with people who have dealt with addiction and gone through recovery, that a physical sobriety does not guarantee emotional sobriety. But emotional sobriety is not possible without physical sobriety. That, in other words, physical sobriety becomes a necessary but not sufficient condition. The great accoutrements of prosperity, of a wealthier society, of some advancement in our material being, make more possible freedom for contemplation, more emotional binds in community. You know, again, to use Kevin's example of the colonist, I believe you have a stronger community with the people you are surrounded by when half of them don't die. And so the advancements we have in a more prosperous society in healthcare and in sanitation and in just the basic amenities out of more modern and advanced living made possible by useful and productive activity of human beings. I would not take these things lightly. So for a full-blown materialist to argue that as we get wealthier, we get happier, these are borderline self-refuting ideas. And yet they need not lead to the other extreme whereby we pretend that the good life is fully divorced from the useful, productive activities that do in fact drive wealthier and more prosperous societies. Is having more things the basis, the foundation of the good life? It is not. I believe the foundation of the good life is the useful, productive activity that stirs the soul of an image bearer of God. And that economic activity, that usefulness, is driving the self-worth, the dignity, and the sort of emotional well-being that makes for a good life, and inevitably making the society materially more prosperous. And for those who want to impede this, or ask the state to impede it, or impose their own Pharisaical gamesmanship, or ask that we trade less with one another because that is not doing anything to add to the good life. All of these things are fallacies that history has not been kind to. All of these things seem to be fallacies we seem hell-bent on repeating. I'd like to ask us to stop. I echo Kevin's sentiment. We took a long time to come up with stuff this stupid, but let's not take so long to get back to what we know is true wisdom and what we know is a real vision of a good life. Prosperity fits in, usefulness drives activity that stirs the soul of mankind in all sorts of good ways. Thank you for listening to David Bonson's Capital Record.